My talk concerns two beautiful and unique passages of the Gospel of John, the Samaritan woman at the well and Mary Magdalene at the empty tomb. In the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the first three of the four canonical Gospels, are known as the Synoptic Gospels because they resemble one another so closely in their presentation of the events that they narrate in the life of Jesus. The Gospel of John, however, presents mainly unique accounts, including the wedding at Cana, the raising of Lazarus, and the foot washing. There are also striking stylistic differences between the Synoptics and John. For example, in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, when Jesus teaches those outside of the 12 disciples, he typically addresses groups and large crowds of people and uses pedagogical forms such as parables and similes that are shorter and easier to remember. In a largely oral culture in which the average person was not well educated, this kind of public teaching was customary. In the Gospel of John, however, when Jesus addresses larger groups, he also teaches with longer extended discourses, such as the Bread of Life discourse, that elaborate on a particular theme or concept. In addition to these groups, we also see Jesus engaged in dialogues with individuals. While Jesus converses with men such as Nicodemus and some of the Pharisees, he also speaks with several women, including the Samaritan woman, Mary and Martha, and Mary Magdalene. These scenes are very striking since the social customs of the day did not permit women to speak with men in this way publicly and intellectually. It is through these conversations, though, that Jesus leads these women to better understand who he is and what he expects of those who follow him, which in turn leads to an interior conversion. I'm going to discuss two of these dialogues, Jesus and the Samaritan woman at the well, and the risen Lord with Mary Magdalene at the empty tomb. To highlight some of the features of these conversations, I will turn to the interpretations of St. John Chrysostom and St. Thomas Aquinas, both of whom give great attention to these accounts. In this way, we will also be in conversation with two of the great doctors of the church. If you'd like to follow me as I go along, I'm going to begin with the account of the Samaritan woman at the well, which is in the Gospel of John, chapter 4, verses 4 to 42. As I quote from this account, I will be using the translations from both the Revised Standard Version and the New American Bible. So, the Samaritan woman at the well. Following the prologue to the Gospel, the evangelist John recounts the preaching of John the Baptist, the baptism of Jesus, the call of the first disciples, the wedding at Cana, the cleansing of the temple, and the discussion between Jesus and Nicodemus. So this is all in the three opening chapters, and these accounts help to establish several of the main themes and images in the Gospel of John that run throughout the entire Gospel, including the revelation of Jesus as the Messiah, the nuptial analogy with Jesus as the bridegroom, the image of water, being born of the Spirit, and God sending his Son for the salvation of the world. We see all of these themes present in the account of the Samaritan woman at the well in chapter 4. In John chapter 4, verses 1 to 6, the evangelist first establishes the context of the account. So John mentions several relevant details of place and time with which his original audience would likely be familiar. So it's important for us to pay attention to these as well. First, John says that as Jesus was traveling from Judea to Galilee, he had to pass through Samaria. Now, Samaria was situated in between Judea and Galilee, and that would be the most direct route to go through Samaria. Yet most Jews chose to avoid this route so as not to come into contact with Samaritans. The fact that Jesus, a Jew, chooses to travel through Samaria is notable. Why did most Jews avoid this region? Well, based on their history of several hundred years, both the Jews and the Samaritans had rival claims to authentic Judaism, including their ethnic identity, the priesthood, the temple, and even their scriptures. The Jews would regard the Samaritans as fallen away Israelites, and there was much animosity between them. As Jesus travels through Samaria, therefore, we see the ways in which he brings the new covenant for universal salvation. John also tells us that Jesus, who was weary from his journey, stops at Jacob's well around noon. The mention of this holy site is important for two reasons. First, it invokes one of the Jewish patriarchs, one of the three main patriarchs, and the covenant as well. Second, there are scenes in ancient literature, including the Old Testament, such as Jacob and Rachel meeting at a well as Moses and his wife, that would suggest a particular literary topos, namely that of a romantic encounter taking place at a well. Expectations of such an encounter are subverted in one sense in our account, but they're fulfilled in another more meaningful sense as the Samaritan woman speaks with Jesus, the bridegroom. John's other details, that Jesus is tired and it is noon, can be understood in more than one level. So we're going to use good patristic exegetical methods and identify different levels of meaning here. Jesus stops because he's tired. So at the literal level, John emphasizes the humanity of Jesus with his weary flesh. At the symbolic level, this claim is anti-docetic. That is, it demonstrates that Jesus is not merely spirit, but he has a real human body, and this substantiates the incarnation. At the mystical level, perhaps John is alluding to the fallen human condition that Jesus has come to redeem. And it's literally the 6th hour. And time was reckoned from a 6 a.m. sunrise. So the 6th hour from 6 a.m. means that it's noon. So this also signifies more than one meaning. At the literal level, the time suggests high noon, when a person would naturally be tired from traveling and is in need of food and drink. At the symbolic level, note that since 7 symbolizes perfection in biblical literature, we're talking about the number 6, which is 7 minus 1. So the number 6 often symbolizes something that's imperfect and in need of completion. And then finally, at the mystical level, it is linked to the 5 husbands and the 6th, the current man with whom the Samaritan woman is living. This points towards Jesus, the bridegroom, who will be the 7th spouse. As Jesus sits by the well in the noonday heat, John simply states that a woman of Samaria came to draw water. So this is a rather straightforward statement. And to initiate the discourse, the tired and thirsty Jesus makes a natural and direct request of the woman for a drink. Still, things are not this simple. This exchange is not only between a Jew and a Samaritan, but also between a man and a woman. Both of these dynamics invoke a complex social system, indicated by the woman's response in verse 9. How is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink of me, a woman of Samaria? The evangelist then explains that Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. The implication of the woman's question is that Jesus would have to drink from a cup or a leather container or bucket or some other vessel that the woman had to draw water with. A Jew would never drink from the vessel of a Samaritan or any non-Jew, for according to Torah, he would incur ritual impurity by doing so. So Jesus, the bearer of the new covenant, though, disregards this. The fact that the Samaritan is also a woman raises yet another set of social boundaries and norms for expected behavior between men and women in antiquity. An ancient person who was observing this scene of Jesus, a stranger coming up to the Samaritan woman in public at noon at a well, would quickly perceive several problems from a socio-cultural context. A woman is appearing alone in public in the middle of the day. She is speaking to a man she does not know and who is not of her household or kin. She is a Samaritan and he is a Jew, and he wants to use something that belongs to her. In the public sphere, men typically interacted with men in antiquity. Men did not talk to women in public to whom they were not related, who were not of their household or kinship structure. In fact, they generally did not even make eye contact with them. Men didn't even often talk to their own wives in public. So also note that she's alone. Women did not go out alone in public because they were concerned about preserving their reputation. So they typically traveled in a group of people, even a group of women, or with a man. Therefore, by appearing alone in public at the well in the middle of the day, the Samaritan woman would be perceived as having no reputation to preserve and be shunned by society. The evangelist does not disclose to us the reason for her bad reputation yet, but the implication is clear. While society would not allow for the woman to redeem herself, by speaking with her, Jesus acknowledges her human dignity and offers her true redemption. St. John Chrysostom wrote 88 homilies on the Gospel of John around the year 390 in Antioch. He devotes 4 long homilies to the conversation between Jesus and the Samaritan woman. These homilies, by the way, would typically take an hour to deliver. So we are talking about fairly long homilies in which he investigates this passage. Chrysostom studied under the famous rhetorician Libanius, and he's very attentive to the formal rhetorical elements of Jesus' words as well as their substance. He's also keenly aware of the extraordinary social significance of Jesus publicly speaking to this woman on an intellectual level, just as Jesus did with Nicodemus in the previous chapter. Chrysostom further notes that rather than observing Jesus perform a miracle, the woman is won over by a simple request. First, Jesus showed her that she deserved to be heard and not to be slighted, and then he revealed himself to her. And if she did not comprehend everything immediately, do not be surprised, for Nicodemus did not either. So says St. John Chrysostom. Now that we have discussed the sociocultural context that John alerts us to in the opening verses of this account, we can imagine that the woman's question, how is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink of me, a woman of Samaria, has an incredulous tone. Something like, what are you asking me? While the woman asks a question that is rooted in ancient social systems, Jesus' lengthy reply in verse 10 elevates the dialogue to a theological level. If you knew the gift of God and what it is that I'm saying to you, give me a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water. There are again many significant words and phrases in Jesus' reply that we should pay attention to. Jesus begins a conditional statement on knowledge. If you knew. That's how he begins his response to her. This indicates to the Samaritan woman that there are different types of knowing. St. Thomas Aquinas, who wrote his commentary on the Gospel of John around the year 1270, notes here that there are, quote, 2 things which lead a person to desire and ask for grace: a knowledge of the good to be desired and a knowledge of the giver, end quote. Here we see Jesus placing an emphasis on this type of knowledge, both with respect to its good and the giver. Accordingly, Jesus then specifies the gift of God. The language of gift invokes divine agency, as well as a giver and a receiver. It is this gift and its reception that allow for redemption. Next, Jesus stresses if she knows who is talking to her. While she sees a Jewish man before her and draws some assumptions, she doesn't really know him. Then Jesus completes the conditional statement. Then she would have asked him. So Jesus offers her something, but she needs to cooperate and be receptive to that. Lastly, Jesus says the result would have been the gift of living water. What Jesus has done through his statement here is to expose the flaws of the sociocultural boundaries and transform them by redefining them with respect to the divine will. Jesus' comment concludes with the mention of the gift of living water. And water, in turn, invokes many senses of meaning. Water is literally needed for survival. Don't forget that this woman, like everyone else at the time, had to come or send a servant, if you had a household of servants, to this public well to draw water for cleaning, cooking, bathing, and so on. Earlier in John's Gospel, physical water figures in the wedding at Cana, where Jesus turns it into wine. And this symbolizes the superabundance that Jesus offers us. And in the discussion with Nicodemus in the previous chapter, where water becomes sacramental, we're told that no one can enter the kingdom of God without being born of water and spirit. While all water is a gift of God, Jesus specifies the gift of living water, so that water becomes symbolic of eternal life. In this way, Jesus intends to direct the woman's thinking away from the physical water that she has come to draw. At first, the woman doesn't respond to the intent of Jesus' comment. In verse 12, she ignores the first part of Jesus' statement, not asking about knowledge or the gift of God or who Jesus is. Instead, she can't figure out how Jesus is going to draw the water without a bucket. Okay. She thinks living water is fresh water, and she thinks that he's blaspheming the patriarch Jacob by presuming to have better water than the water that Jacob's well provides. Even here, we can see, though, that she is making some connections based on the knowledge that Jesus is giving her. When Jesus explains the difference between the well water that only temporarily assuages thirst and living water that permanently assuages thirst and gives eternal life, this is in verses 13 to 14, then the Samaritan woman asks for the water that quenches thirst forever. Note that she does not fully understand yet, for she does not mention eternal life. Rather, she seems to be envisioning a type of water that permanently quenches physical, not spiritual thirst. It's interesting in this very long scene to see Jesus so patiently explaining these things to this foreign woman. When we think of all other accounts in the Gospels where Jesus can be impatient with those who are slow to understand, even and sometimes especially the disciples. Clearly, Jesus knows that she's capable of understanding him and that she will help to proclaim the gospel. Thus, the scene is about this process of understanding who Jesus is. In this case, like that of Nicodemus, it's a slow, gradual process. St. John Chrysostom comments repeatedly on the nature of this back and forth between Jesus and the woman. As we might expect given his rhetorical training, Chrysostom attends to the style of the argumentation. He advises, quote, reflect on the wisdom of Christ, how he drew the woman upward gradually, and thereby caused the woman to understand more clearly, end quote. By appealing to her on terms from her Samaritan background at first, Chrysostom says that Jesus helps the woman to form an opinion on him on these grounds and brings her to a well-reasoned faith. Unlike the Pharisees, who often strike a combative tone, the woman, says Chrysostom, responds fittingly, respectfully, and with great decorum. He continues, the woman, with great propriety, in the midst of the heat and at midday, both spoke and listened to everything with great patience. End quote. In this way, the Samaritan woman becomes a model for us in the reception of the gospel. Chrysostom then exhorts his listeners, let us then imitate the Samaritan woman. Let us converse with Christ. Jesus now needs to take the woman to more of a spiritual level. So he gives her some insight into who he is by displaying his omniscience. In verses 16 to 18, he directs her to go and call her husband. He then informs her by way of a clever disclosure that he knows that she has had 5 husbands and is now living with a 6th man. The directive to call her husband while she is standing before Jesus the bridegroom is not without its irony. Realizing that this stranger could not know this information otherwise, the woman concludes that he's a prophet. This is in verses 19 to 20. What does she mean exactly by prophet? The Samaritans only had their copies of the books of Torah, of the Pentateuch. They did not recognize the other writings of the Hebrew scriptures, including the books of the prophets. So by mentioning the prophet, she would probably be thinking of Deuteronomy 34:10 and God's promise to send a prophet like Moses. This promise was also the basis of Samaritan messianic expectations. So if she thinks Jesus is this prophet, then her remark is significant. Note, however, that she distinguishes this mountain where Samaritans worship, that is Mount Gerizim, from Jerusalem where the Jews worship. Therefore, she seems to recognize him not as the prophet, but maybe as a prophet of the Jews. Jesus thus needs to convey to her precisely who he is, so he speaks to her of the eschaton in verse 21, the imminent coming of God's kingdom, where location of worship will be meaningless. He further comments on the nature of God and salvation in verses 21 to 24. While salvation is from the Jews, he says, the hour is coming when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, thus acknowledging the original covenant with the Jews that has now become universal with Christ. The woman makes some progress. She still doesn't realize who Jesus is, but she knows that he's talking about the Messiah. At the same time, she may realize more than it would appear. She defines the Messiah as the one who will tell us all things in verse 25. And Jesus has just told her some things that no stranger could know about her. So maybe she's thinking that Jesus may be the Messiah, but she doesn't want to say it out loud, lest she is wrong. By bringing her to this point, the stage has been set for Jesus to reveal his identity. He says in verse 26, I am he, the one who is speaking with you. So Jesus has declared ego, eimi, the 2 Greek words, I am. The Samaritan woman would probably hear the echo of God speaking from the burning bush to Moses in Exodus chapter 3, verse 14, where God discloses his name, I am, and understand that Jesus is conveying his divinity and oneness with God. At precisely this moment, when we expect the woman to respond, the disciples appear on the scene. John tells us that the disciples are struck that he was talking to a woman. That is, by the breaking of these entrenched social rules, although they know better than to question him. They've just gone to get some food, and when they ask him to eat, Jesus speaks of already having food. The disciples don't understand that he's speaking of spiritual food. And in another instance of irony, they wonder who else brought him food while they were gone. Their misunderstanding provides the occasion for Jesus, through a series of proverbs about sowing, reaping, and food harvesting, to teach them. So what happened to the Samaritan woman? After Jesus reveals his identity, John tells us that she left her water jar behind, which indicates that she's no longer thinking of literal water, but of spiritual water. The Samaritan woman then went to the town and told the people, come see a man who told me all that I ever did. Can this be the Christ? Her criterion for the Messiah in verse 25 is that he will tell them everything. And this is how she describes Jesus to the people in the town. So it would seem that she's not asking anymore whether Jesus is the Messiah, but rather declaring it. St. John Chrysostom notes that by phrasing it as a question, can this be the Christ? The woman imitates Jesus' method to draw the people in gradually. In verse 39, John states that many Samaritans believed in Jesus based on her testimony. While women were not allowed to offer testimony in court in antiquity, the Samaritan woman, once shunned by society, has testified publicly to the Messiah, and they believed her. St. Thomas strikingly comments that, quote, "We have the fruit which relates to the woman by what she said to her people. She was taking on the role of an apostle," end quote. She is the last person her peers would expect to be giving testimony to the Messiah, a Samaritan, a woman, and one married 5 times and living with a 6th man. Through his dialogue with her, however, Jesus, the bridegroom, the 7th and perfect spouse, has offered her the grace of redemption to become his follower as a bride of Christ. So I'm going to turn now to a passage near the end of the gospel, the risen Lord and Mary Magdalene at the empty tomb. This is in chapter 20, verses 1 to 18. As with most of his gospel, John includes unique accounts of the empty tomb and post-resurrection appearances of Christ compared to the Synoptic Gospels. At the end of chapter 19, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus have anointed the body of Jesus with spices and laid it in a new tomb in a garden. At the beginning of chapter 20, Mary Magdalene goes to the tomb. The Synoptics recount a slightly different version of this, that Mary Magdalene and at least one other woman went to the tomb to anoint Jesus' body, and they found the stone rolled away, and 1 or 2 young men or an angel with a luminous appearance who informs them that Jesus has risen, and they are to tell the disciples that he will meet them in Galilee. In the 4th gospel, however, John focuses on Mary Magdalene alone, so that in keeping with his emphasis, he can highlight the transformative dialogue between Mary Magdalene and the risen Lord. So why does Mary Magdalene go to the tomb? John does not mention that she was intending to take the spices to anoint the body of Jesus. In fact, he comments that this is what happened at the end of the previous chapter already. The evangelist instead comments that it was still dark when Mary Magdalene went to the tomb early in the morning on the first day of the week. That is, after Sabbath restrictions have been lifted. These details suggest that she has taken her first opportunity to go to the tomb. Since Jesus has been crucified as a serious criminal, she's taking great risk by going to the tomb because she would be associating herself with him. It seems that she just wants to be close to his resting place. St. Thomas comments further that she is, quote, incited by her exceedingly great love for Jesus. As Mary Magdalene approaches the tomb, she sees that the stone has been rolled away already. And seeing this, she leaves and goes to tell Simon Peter and the beloved disciple that, quote, they have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him. Apparently, when she saw that the tomb was empty, she concluded that the body had been moved or stolen rather than resurrected. So she says they have taken the Lord out of the tomb. Who does she mean by they? Perhaps the Jews who rejected Jesus, or maybe even the Roman soldiers who were guarding the tomb. In verses 3 to 10, John recounts Simon Peter and the beloved disciple going to the tomb, with the beloved disciple outrunning Peter and getting there first. What he does then, though, is he does not go in the tomb, but instead defers to Peter. But the beloved disciple glimpses in the tomb the linen cloths that are lying there. When Peter goes in, he sees the cloth that had been on Jesus' head in a different place from the other cloth that had been on his body, which suggests that something else occurred than that the body was stolen. That is, why would the cloth be left behind and placed deliberately like that if someone had just taken his body? Finally, the beloved disciple goes in, and he saw and believed. In verse 10, John tells us that they then went back to their homes. So they understand something of what happened in the empty tomb, and they leave. When they leave, John tells us, Mary Magdalene remains weeping at the tomb, which suggests that they have not spoken to her. They just passed by her. So this might seem a bit odd that they don't say anything to her, but it's in keeping with one of the main themes of John's gospel, which is that everyone must have their own personal encounter with the Lord. Mary Magdalene is mentioned for the first time in John's gospel as one of the women at the foot of the cross. This is in chapter 19, verse 25. Therefore, she must have been one of his followers for quite some time, although she's not mentioned earlier in this gospel. However, in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 8, verse 2, near the beginning of Jesus' ministry, Luke tells us that Mary Magdalene had been exorcised of 7 demons, and she, along with some other women, provided for Jesus and the 12 out of their means. With Luke's account, we learn that she was the recipient of Jesus' miraculous power through an exorcism, and that she became a loyal follower of Jesus from then on all the way to the cross. So her love for Jesus and zeal to get to the tomb quickly is thus more understandable with this context. As Mary weeps, she stoops to look in the tomb and sees 2 angels in white sitting where the body of Jesus had lain. They ask her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" Earlier in the gospel, during the account of the wedding at Cana, Jesus addresses his mother as woman also. While this address may seem unusual for Jesus to refer to Mary as woman, the word woman is meant to recall the creation narrative and the woman Eve. For Jesus to address his mother as woman stresses the role of Mary as the new Eve, who always follows the will of God, which includes bearing the Son of God, the new Adam. All of these elements invoke the new creation theme in the Gospel of John. Since the tomb is located in a garden, Mary Magdalene goes there the first day of the week, and she is also addressed as woman. And throughout all of these details, John once again emphasizes the theme of the new creation in Christ's salvific act. The angels also ask Mary Magdalene why she is weeping, which is the 3rd reference to her weeping in verses 11 to 13. Why does John mention this 3 times? So it's understandable that in her grief following the death of Jesus on the cross, the one who helped her heal her of demons and whom she followed all the way to the cross, that Mary Magdalene would be weeping from grief at his tomb. Her tears seem to signify more than just grief, however. In keeping with his earlier comments, St. Thomas remarks that Mary Magdalene remains at the tomb, quote, because of her unwavering love, which had inflamed her heart, and that her devotion is admired because it is issued in tears, which St. Thomas indicates is a sign of her desire for heavenly things. The angel's question implies that the time for weeping has come to an end. But Mary Magdalene does not yet recognize this, as her response to the angels indicates when she repeats her conclusion that the body of the Lord has been taken away. The stress on weeping also recalls another instance of weeping in the Gospel of John. In chapter 11, Mary, the sister of Martha and Lazarus, weeps for her dead brother. When Jesus sees her tears and those of the Jews who accompany her, he also weeps. Note that the Greek verb here is different from the weeping of the Jews and Mary than the weeping of Jesus. And this is John's way of emphasizing the uniqueness of Jesus' tears. How do we understand the weeping of Jesus? St. Thomas says that Jesus weeps from compassion as he looks lovingly at these people who are suffering from the effects of original sin, here represented by the death of Lazarus, the brother of Mary and Martha, and also the friend of Jesus. Now Mary Magdalene weeps for Jesus. At the moment when Mary Magdalene responds, John states, quote, she turned around and saw Jesus standing, but she did not know that it was Jesus. This is in verse 14. Why did she not recognize Jesus? So some interpreters claim there's something about the glorified body that prevents Mary Magdalene from recognizing him. But it's more likely that the risen Lord has prevented her from recognizing him for the time being. Why did Mary Magdalene turn around to begin with? St. John Chrysostom has a wonderful interpretation of this, saying that, quote, as she said these words, Christ suddenly appeared behind her and startled the angels, who on beholding their master immediately showed by their attitude, by their gaze, and then by their movements that they were looking at the Lord. This awakened the curiosity of the woman and caused her to turn around, end quote. So I think that's about as good as interpretation I've heard of Mary's turning. In verse 15, Jesus asks Mary Magdalene, woman, why are you weeping? Whom do you seek? He repeats the exact words of the angel's question, again invoking the creation theme by addressing her as woman and questioning the reason for her tears. But then Jesus adds, whom do you seek? Jesus raises one of the main themes of the entire Gospel of John with this question, which is the search or quest motif. We see many people engaged throughout the Gospel, sometimes collectively or individually, on this quest to seek and find Jesus and understand who he is. To seek Jesus is ultimately to seek the risen Lord. Jesus wants to direct her away from the tomb because the object of her seeking is no longer there. With a touch of irony, John tells us that Mary Magdalene presumed that Jesus was the gardener. The reason for this is also unclear to us. Perhaps just the setting of the garden and his presence there suggests this to her. However, this is also likely an allusion to the Genesis creation story with the image of God as the gardener. So here we have the new Eve and the new Adam in a garden. Mary Magdalene asks whether the gardener has carried him away. If he tells her where, she will take him away. This exchange indicates to us that Mary Magdalene has not considered the possibility of the resurrection, but remains focused on the missing body of Jesus, which she thinks has been taken elsewhere. If she can discover where Jesus has been taken, she will even go retrieve the body. While Mary Magdalene likely accepted the notion of resurrection, as many first century Jews did, she probably expected it to happen in the distant future and as a collective event, not the raising of one body right now in the present. So Jesus now needs to reveal himself to her and demonstrate that the resurrection has truly occurred. In verse 16, Jesus addresses her simply by her name, Mary. In response, she turns again and says Rabboni, which John indicates is Hebrew for teacher. Mary seems to address Jesus with the title she customarily uses. This indeed is the teacher. So how did she recognize Jesus at this moment when Jesus calls her by name? There are several possible allusions here, and we can consider all of them working in a polyvalent way, that is, conveying many meanings at once. The first is the fact that Adam names Eve, so the naming of Eve by Adam. This would further stress the new creation theme. We also have Jesus' discourse on the Good Shepherd, and in that account, Jesus refers to the Good Shepherd who calls all of his sheep by name. Lastly, there is the simple power of the name, one's personal name, one's own name. And the Lord calls us by name into a personal, loving relationship with him. It's only at the sound of her own name that Mary Magdalene recognizes the risen Lord. At this moment, she turns for a second time. So why does she turn twice? So we might envision a partial turning the first time and then the completion of the turning the second time. But once again, St. John Chrysostom offers another possible suggestion, concluding that after that first turn, which was prompted by the reaction of the angels as they saw the resurrected Lord, that she turned back to her original position to the angels. So at the mention of her name, then she turns around a second time. So with these two turnings, and why we have to ask why John emphasizes this twice, we have once again several layers of meaning. So what John is conveying to us by people running to the tomb, the weeping, the speaking, and here the turning, is that this experience is a very physical one, as faith in the risen Lord encompasses the whole person. Mary Magdalene also turns away from the absence of the empty tomb and her focus on the body of Jesus, and turns to the presence of the risen Lord. These two turnings then suggest more generally a reorientation of one's life to the resurrected Christ. Following the naming of each other, Jesus tells Mary Magdalene in verse 17, "Do not hold me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father, but go to my brethren and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." So Jesus begins by saying, "Do not hold me." So why does Jesus direct her in this way, not to hold him? So either she's already holding him and he doesn't want her to, or he's trying to prevent her from grasping him in the first place. So it makes sense that in her recognition of the Lord and her joy, that perhaps she falls at his feet and clasps onto him in some sort of way. The Greek word here, haptomai, literally means to cling to. So it is likely that Mary Magdalene was physically holding him. By directing her to release him, though, and telling her to go to the apostles, the risen Lord indicates that now she is to stop holding on to him in this way that she was formerly seeking him, and instead to proclaim the gospel of the resurrected Lord. The directive to the apostles, whom he describes as my brethren, and if you notice this familial term that the risen Lord uses for the disciples is characteristic of relations in the household of God. And he directs her to go to his brethren and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. So this language of my Father, your Father, my God, and your God, on the one hand, shows us this distinction between Jesus' unique relationship to God the Father and our relationship to God the Father. But it's also covenant language. The Jews could speak of their Father as God. And so now we see another instance of the universal new covenant. For her faith in Jesus and following him to the cross and the empty tomb, Mary Magdalene is given the grace to be the first person to witness the risen Lord and to proclaim that witness to the disciples. John completes the account by reporting Mary Magdalene's very simple yet powerful proclamation, "I have seen the Lord." There's one last allusion that I'd like to mention here, the Song of Songs. St. Thomas compares Mary Magdalene's love for Christ the Bridegroom to the description of the love of the bride in the Song of Songs, chapter 8. Its flashes are flashes of fire, a most vehement flame. There are other relevant verses as well. Consider especially the Song of Songs, chapter 3, verses 1 to 4. In these verses, the bride seeks the one her soul loves. She rises and goes to seek him, but does not find him. She asks others if they know where he is. When she does find him, she holds him and will not let the bridegroom go. We see the relevance to this account in the Gospel of John. Mary Magdalene has ardently sought the bridegroom and found him at last. The bride of Christ will hold him in her heart forever.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lewis, for that excellent lecture. For everyone watching, so now we'll begin our Q&A. Please do submit questions in the chat on YouTube or on Facebook, and we will queue those up for Dr. Lewis. The first question that I have for you, Dr. Lewis, in the Gospels, it always seems like the appearance of Samaritans, it's always noted. It always seems kind of pregnant, with meaning. Could you speak a little bit more about the background of the relationship between the Jews and the Samaritans, the sort of source of the rupture between them, and then also generally about their significance in the gospel?
As I mentioned, the Samaritans and the Jews had these rival claims to be the true Israelites. This goes back several centuries to the 8th century BC, when the northern kingdom of Israel fell to the Assyrians and many numbers of Israelites were deported. And following that, some of them were not re-assimilated into the people of Israel, but married foreigners. So from the Jewish perspective, these people of Samaria were that group of people who had intermarried with foreigners and then were ethnically not the true Israel. From the Samaritan perspective, as they were deported and lived in these other places, they retained earlier forms of Judaism, including the earlier recension of the Pentateuch, which is known as the Samaritan Pentateuch. They had their own priesthood, they had their own temple, and so they regarded themselves as the authentic Israel. So that's their account. But from the Jewish perspective, and we see this from the Jewish historian Josephus as well in the 1st century, as well as the scriptural account, they no longer were ethnic Israel. So they're not classified as Gentiles, which is the term used for any non-Jew in the New Testament, but just rather a non-Israelite people is kind of how we would want to think of them. So from the Jewish perspective, according to Torah and the 613 laws of Torah, if they were to interact with them or eat from their utensils or enter their home, they would incur ritual impurity. So Jesus, as I mentioned, John says he had to go through Samaria. Well, he didn't have to. He could have gone around the country of Samaria, but he goes through it intentionally so he can evangelize these people there. And this shows us a broadening of the covenant. It begins with the Jews. As John says, salvation is from the Jews. But Jesus is showing the universal nature of the covenant. So by particularly going to this people, that accomplishes this. The other place we see Samaritan's figure really is in the parable of the Good Samaritan in the Gospel of Luke. And I think sometimes the Good Samaritan loses its potency for us now. We think of a Good Samaritan as someone who just helps somebody else. But the Samaritan, from the perspective of the Jew at the time, would be the least likely person who would help this poor man who's laying by the wayside. So if you think about different peoples and cultures who have an intense dislike for one another, that's what the Samaritan represents to the Jews. But he's the one who helps, not the priest, not the Levite, but the Samaritan. So to think of a Good Samaritan would kind of be an oxymoron, but again, that parable demonstrates the opening of the covenant to those who really follow the will of God.
All All right. Our next question is in both stories from John, the women end up evangelists, sharers of the good news of Christ. Is this something notable, particularly in how Christ might have viewed the role of women in Christian life?
So I think it's interesting if you look at the genealogy in Matthew's Gospel, for instance. Genealogies trace physical descendants through the patrilineal line, which means the descendants of men. So the son of the son of the son of. And Matthew's genealogy includes 5 women. Mary is the last of these women. And so the importance of Matthew's genealogy, including these women, if you go back to the Old Testament, this includes Ruth, for example, is that God has always worked through women to accomplish his divine plan. And women who are faithful to God have been rewarded by God through history. So I think that's important for Matthew to remind us of that women have always been important in salvation and in the covenant and in God's plan with his people. And we see, in fact, of course, the Messiah comes from a line of many notable women, such as Sarah. So I think in terms of the proclamation of the gospel publicly, that this is notable. As I mentioned, women wouldn't be acknowledged as teachers or philosophers or as rabbis in antiquity. And though there were some well-educated women, typically wealthier women would have the time and the money and the means to be educated, the average woman would not. And so we don't really see women being engaged this way in the intellectual sphere and in public discourse and so on. So for Jesus to involve both of these women in his mission, as he does elsewhere, I mentioned that passage in the Gospel of Luke, where Luke is very clear that there were several women following Jesus and in fact funding some of his ministry. So this does seem to be a fairly novel element in Jesus' ministry. And it's another way for him to teach against some of these double standards of these social codes, that the universal covenant is for everyone.
Maureen, I think I'm saying that right, Maureen from YouTube notes that she says that Mary Magdalene was the first one who saw the resurrected Jesus, and he told her to go and proclaim the good news to the brethren. Was Mary Magdalene then, could we say that she was the first evangelist?
I like to think of Mary, the mother of Jesus, as the first evangelist. So I think if you're talking about following the resurrection, that does seem to be a grace given to Mary Magdalene. Yes.
All right, next question. So you mentioned during your talk, you said, in keeping with John's gospel, everyone must have their own personal encounter with the Lord. I was hoping you could just speak a little bit more about that, about sort of the character of John's gospel in these, he seems to go out of his way to orchestrate these personal encounters.
So I mentioned at the beginning that typically when Jesus interacts with people in Matthew, Mark, and Luke's Gospels, it's in crowds, sometimes very large crowds, thousands of people at the feeding miracles, for example. And we don't see as much of that in the Gospel of John. And we see many of these individual encounters that Jesus has. So not only with the women I talked about, but also with the sisters Mary and Martha, also with Nicodemus, and some other individual apostles that don't figure as prominently in the other Gospels. One of the main themes of the Gospel of John is expressed by the Greek verb meno, M-E-N-O, basically, and that means to remain or to dwell. And we see that the indwelling of the divine presence is a very prominent theme in the Gospel of John, and the way that's conveyed is that this is in every individual follower of Jesus who opens him or herself up to him can have the presence of God indwelling. And so I think this is part of the reason that we have a focus on these long discourses and dialogues and one-on-one encounters that we see in the Gospel of John. We see this personalist aspect that Jesus conveys who he is and what his mission is in a very particular way, an individual way to each one of these people. And they become really paradigms and models of discipleship for us. You can really go through the Gospel of John probably and find someone that expresses some aspect of yourself and how you have received the gospel.
All right, our next question comes from Elizabeth on YouTube. So this is a question about virginity. So she asks, did Jesus intend for his celibate women followers to be described, be accepted or not, or valued differently based on whether they are literally virgins? So I guess the question is just, what is the significance of virginity in the Christian tradition?
The whole Christian tradition?
Sorry,
in the Gospel
just the
of John?
Gospels,
I mean, I could speak to that point as well.
Maybe the narrower question is better.
Okay. So, we have some different ways this plays out a little bit. Clearly, the Samaritan woman is not a virgin. She's been married 5 times. She's living with another man. We could say that as she accepts Christ as the bridegroom, her 7th spouse, maybe she will now lead a life of consecration. That is not explicitly mentioned, though. We see with Mary Magdalene, she's not associated with a spouse throughout in her appearances either, so she also would seem to be someone who's following Jesus in this way. And then with Mary and Martha. So Mary and Martha are interesting because they are these 2 adult women living with their brother Lazarus. Their parents are never mentioned, and we have these 3 adult siblings who are living together and who it's established that they have this pre-existing friendship with Jesus. They're very close friends with him. And I read that as there being something of a proto-ascetic or monastic group because they would be married. Jewish convention would dictate that by the age of 18, Jewish men married, and that by a much younger age, Jewish women would marry. So Mary, Martha, and Lazarus have not married but are living together like this. So I think you could say that looking at that, there's that suggestion that at least these people are called to follow Jesus in that objectively higher way of a consecrated life of celibacy and virginity. And then you have the view of marriage, and if I could comment on that just briefly, I think the fact that Jesus initiates his ministry in the Gospel of John with the wedding at Cana, and we see the sacramental nature of that wedding. He's showing us through the nature of that, revealing himself to his disciples in the miracle of turning the water into wine, that this is the other vocation, to the married life. So I think if you look for it in the Gospel of John, you see both states of life, both vocations, and both ways of following Jesus.